I used to hate running at night, not because of the effort, but because of the silence. It always felt like something was waiting just outside the edges of my vision. Even in training, those midnight jogs around Fort Benning would send a chill down my spine when the woods got too quiet. Funny how that same eerie silence now feels like a luxury. These days, the screams drown out everything. We got the call at 0300, some mess in New York City. The higher-ups didn't give us much containment breach urban quarantine non-combatants. At risk, it all sounded like the usual cleanup job, the kind you don't talk about later. But this wasn't usual, not even close. When we touched down in Manhattan, the city looked like a war zone. Smoke billowed from burning cars, windows were smashed, and the streets were littered with debris and bodies. Some of them moved, jerking unnaturally. I tried not to look too closely. Our squad 8 of us from the 75th Ranger Regiment pushed forward cautiously, sweeping each block as we went. Captain Morris led the way, barking orders through his radio while Jenkins, our medic, stuck close to me. Jenkins was always cracking jokes, even during firefights, but tonight he was quiet. We all were. Anyone else notice the smell? Martinez muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, we noticed. The air reeked of rot and copper, like a slaughterhouse left to bake in the sun. It clung to our gear, our skin, our lungs. The first infected we encountered was a woman, maybe mid-30s, wearing a blood-soaked dress. She was standing in the middle of the street, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ma, I am, are you hurt?" Morris called out. She didn't respond, just stood there twitching. Then she charged. Her speed caught us off guard. 1 second she was 10 feet away, and the next she was clawing at Morris, her teeth snapping inches from his face. It took 3 rounds to drop her. Even then, she kept twitching on the ground, her mouth working like she was chewing on air. "What the hell was that?" Jenkins whispered, his hands trembling as he reloaded his rifle. "Stay focused," Morris snapped. But his voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. Fear. Our mission was to secure an apartment complex where the outbreak supposedly started. The place loomed ahead of us, a 12-story tower of cracked windows and flickering lights. The front doors hung open, smeared with bloody handprints. "This is bad," Jenkins said, shaking his head. "Stay frosty," Morris replied. "We get in, secure the survivors, and get out. Rules of engagement are clear: anything hostile goes down." The lobby was a mess of overturned furniture and dark, sticky pools I didn't want to think about. We moved as a unit, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The farther in we went, the louder the sounds became: thuds, groans, and the occasional inhuman screech. On the 3rd floor, we found them, a mother and her 2 kids huddled in a corner. Their faces were pale, their clothes stained with grime and blood. The mother clutched a kitchen knife, pointing it at us with shaking hands. "Get away," she screamed. "They're everywhere." "Ma, I am, we're here to help," Morris said, lowering his weapon. But before he could say more, the wall behind us exploded. A figure burst through the drywall, its face a mess of rotting flesh and jagged teeth. It slammed into Martinez, dragging him to the ground. "Contact rear," I shouted, opening fire. The bullets tore through the creature, but it didn't stop. Jenkins had to unload half a magazine into its skull before it finally went limp. That was the moment we realized what we were dealing with. These things weren't just fast, they were relentless. Headshots were the only way to put them down, and even then you had to be sure. It wasn't long before Martinez started coughing. Then he started convulsing. "Don't let me turn," he gasped, blood bubbling from his mouth. None of us could bring ourselves to do it. Jenkins tried to help him, but it was too late. Martinez's eyes glazed over, and his body went still. Then he lunged. I'll never forget the sound of his teeth sinking into Jenkins's throat. By the time we reached the 6th floor, there were only 4 of us left: Morris, Jenkins barely holding on, Taylor, and me. Every hallway was a gauntlet. The infected poured out of apartments, clawing at us with raw, bloody fingers. Their screams echoed in my head long after we gunned them down. On the 8th floor, we found a nest, at least 20 of them crammed into one apartment. feasting on what was left of the tenants. The walls were covered in crude symbols drawn in blood, and the smell was enough to make me gag. "We're not getting out of here," Taylor muttered, his voice cracking. "Yes, we are," Morris growled. "We finished the mission." But deep down, I think we all knew the truth. This wasn't a mission anymore. It was a death sentence. By the time we reached the roof, it was just me and Morris. The infected were everywhere, clawing their way up the stairwell, their shrieks deafening. "Go," Morris shouted, shoving me toward the helicopter waiting on the edge of the roof. "What about you?" I yelled. He didn't answer, just turned to face the door, his rifle raised. I hesitated for a moment, then ran. The last thing I saw before climbing into the chopper was Morris disappearing under a wave of infected. That was 3 days ago. The city's gone now, completely overrun. They've quarantined the whole island, but it won't hold. This thing is spreading too fast. I'm back at base, but I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces: Martinez, Jenkins, Morris. And those things, always screaming, always hungry. They say we're being deployed again tomorrow, this time to Boston. But I know how this ends. It doesn't matter how many of us they send. The dark always wins. I didn't want to get back on that helicopter. None of us did. The survivors from the last op, what few there were, kept to themselves, hollow-eyed and jumpy. We'd been reinforced with fresh faces, new boots who hadn't seen what we had. They joked nervously as we loaded gear, their laughter falling flat against the silence of those of us who knew better. This time, the orders were clear: sweep the infected out of a specific sector in Boston and hold it. We were supposed to secure a foothold for civilian evacuations. A joke, really. Everyone knew this wasn't about saving people. It was about slowing the spread, buying time. For what? I don't know. Maybe they think they can fix this. Maybe they're just stalling until there's no one left to fix. The city looked worse than New York. Entire neighborhoods were gutted by fire, and the infected moved in packs now, like predators. We touched down in the middle of a combat zone. Civilians ran screaming as soldiers fought to hold the line, barricades crumbling under the weight of the horde. "Move, move, move," the lieutenant shouted as we disembarked, fanning out to secure the perimeter. I could already feel it, the sinking realization that we were too late. The infected were everywhere, pouring through alleyways and smashing through windows like a living flood. The new guys weren't ready. Private O'Neill froze when he saw them, his rifle dangling uselessly at his side. I had to shove him behind cover before one of those things took his head off. "They're not people anymore," I yelled. "Shoot them." It didn't help. O'Neill was gone 2 minutes later, dragged screaming into the shadows. By nightfall, we were forced underground. The streets weren't safe anymore if they ever were. We found refuge in the subway tunnels, setting up a makeshift command post with what little gear we had left. The tunnels were a maze, pitch black and suffocatingly quiet. Every sound echoed, every shadow looked like it was moving. We took shifts watching the entrances, but the infected were smart. They didn't rush us all at once. They stalked us, picking off stragglers one by one. By the third day, we were down to half strength, supplies were running low, and morale was even lower. "I can't do this," Taylor muttered, cradling his rifle like a security blanket. "I can't go back out there." "We don't have a choice," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The brass finally sent us new orders: push deeper into the tunnels and destroy the nest. Apparently, the infected weren't spreading randomly. They were organizing, gathering in one place. If we could wipe them out, maybe we'd have a chance. "Suicide mission," Jenkins said, spitting on the ground. "They're just sending us to die." He wasn't wrong, but we went anyway. What else could we do? The nest was deeper than I expected. The air grew heavier the farther we went, the stench of decay making it hard to breathe. The walls were slick with something wet and black, and the sound of them, their moans, their clicks, grew louder with every step. And then we found it. The cavern, huge and pulsating with unnatural life. Hundreds of infected packed together, their bodies writhing as if they were one. At the center was something larger, something worse, a mass of flesh and bone and teeth that defied explanation. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. "Doesn't matter," Morris said. "Light it up." The second we opened fire, the nest came alive. The infected swarmed us, clawing and biting with inhuman fury. The thing at the center screamed, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like my skull would split. We threw everything we had at it, grenades, flamethrowers, the works, didn't matter. For every one we killed, 10 more took its place. "Fall back," Morris shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. But there was nowhere to go. The tunnel behind us had collapsed, cutting off our escape. One by one, I watched my squad fall. Jenkins went first, dragged into the swarm. Taylor held them off as long as he could, screaming curses until the end. In the end, it was just me. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was firing blindly into the horde, and the next I was stumbling through the sewers covered in blood and bile. Somehow I made it back to the surface, to the extraction point. They didn't ask questions when they found me, just hauled me onto the chopper and sedated me. Now I'm back at base, waiting for the next mission. They keep telling me it'll be different this time, that we'll have better intel, better equipment. But I know better. This thing we're fighting, it's not something we can win against. It's not even something we can understand. All we can do is keep fighting, until there's nothing left to fight for. I never thought I'd miss the crowded streets of Anchorage. As a reporter, I've always thrived on the chaos of the city, chasing stories, scribbling notes, and dodging deadlines. But when the Army sent me to shadow the 11th Airborne Division in Alaska for a human interest piece, I thought I'd struck gold. The cold, vast wilderness was a stark contrast to the usual grind, and the soldiers were tough but kind. It was supposed to be a simple assignment. But nothing about this was simple. It started like any other evening. The air was bitterly cold, and snow swirled outside the barracks. Inside, the soldiers joked around, their laughter bouncing off the wooden walls. I was in the corner with my notepad, sipping terrible coffee and pretending to write. Honestly, I felt out of place. I wasn't one of them, but they tolerated me, even teased me like I was their kid brother. That night we got the call, a distress signal from a remote village. It wasn't unusual. Isolated communities often faced emergencies during the brutal winters. The soldiers geared up, and I followed, eager for the action. I didn't realize that I was walking into a nightmare. The village, when we arrived, was eerily silent. No howling dogs, no flicker of lights in the windows, just snow-covered roofs and the faint sound of the wind. "What the hell?" Sergeant Miller muttered. We split into teams to check the houses. I stayed close to Corporal Davis, a young guy with a lopsided grin who always called me City Boy. He carried his rifle like an extension of his arm, scanning every shadow. The first few houses were empty, untouched. Beds unmade, fires cold in the hearth. It was like everyone had just vanished. Then we found the church. Inside, the smell hit me first. Rot, blood, and something metallic. The pews were overturned, and the floor was slick with dark stains. At the altar, a figure hunched over something or someone. "Ma am, step away," Davis ordered, raising his weapon. The figure turned slowly, and I felt my stomach drop. Her face was pale, her eyes black as coal, and her mouth, oh God, her mouth was smeared with blood. She let out a guttural shriek and lunged at us. Davis fired, the shot echoing through the church. The woman crumpled to the floor, but it wasn't over. From the shadows, more figures emerged, men, women, even children. Their bodies moved unnaturally, jerking like marionettes on tangled strings. Their eyes were all the same, empty, lifeless, hungry. We ran. Outside, chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted orders, gunfire crackled, and the infected swarmed like locusts. They weren't just attacking, they were spreading. One bite, one scratch, and you were one of them. I remember Davis grabbing my arm, pulling me towards the Humvee. "Come on, city boy, move." But before we reached it, one of those things tackled him. I froze, watching as he screamed, his hands trying to push it away. Blood sprayed across the snow. I wanted to help him, I really did, but my legs wouldn't move. "Run," he screamed, his voice breaking. "Just go." So I ran. Back at the base, the mood was grim. Half of the squad hadn't made it back. The ones who did were different, quieter, haunted, and then the first symptoms started. The infection spread faster than we could contain it. Fever, vomiting, uncontrollable rage. Once it took hold, there was no coming back. We tried quarantining the sick, but it didn't matter. They turned, and when they did, they tore through the barracks like animals. I hid in a storage closet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Through the slats, I saw Sergeant Miller fighting off one of his own men. He didn't stand a chance. The worst part wasn't the gore or the screams, it was the silence that followed. His days turned into weeks. The base was overrun, the radio silent. I was alone. Sometimes I thought I heard voices, laughter, footsteps, but it was just the wind. I tried to keep a routine, writing in my notebook to keep my sanity. But the entries became more erratic as the food ran out and the cold crept in. I wrote about Davis, about Miller, about the village. I wrote about my mom back in Anchorage and how I never called her enough. Eventually, I stopped writing. One morning, I woke to the sound of the infected outside. They had found me. I don't know how they didn't seem to see or hear the way we did. Maybe they just knew. I had one bullet left in my pistol. As they banged on the door, I thought about Davis, about his grin and the way he called me city boy. I thought about my mom and her laugh, the way she used to make pancakes on Sundays. I thought about the people I'd failed to save, the stories I'd never tell. The door splintered and they came through, their black eyes locking onto me. I raised the gun. And then there was nothing but darkness. I used to think Moscow was indestructible. The city that never truly sleeps, always alive with the hum of life, from the babushkas bustling through markets to the thrum of traffic choking the wide boulevards. My name is Yuri Ivanov, Senior Sergeant of the VDV Russia's Airborne Elite. I was born in Moscow. I loved it, hated it, feared it, but I never thought I'd be fighting to save it from something I couldn't even understand. The first cases started in the suburbs. A block of apartments quarantined under whispers of a new flu. We didn't think much of it. This was Moscow, after all. Our government had dealt with worse protests, bombings, economic crashes. But then the reports turned stranger people attacking each other like rabid animals, spreading the infection with bites and scratches. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. I remember the call. It came through at 2 a.m. "Get to Red Square," the captain barked over the line. "We're fortifying the Kremlin. It's bad, Ivanov. Bring your gear." The drive through the empty streets was the first time I realized something was deeply wrong. Normally, even at night, Moscow had this pulse. But now, dead silence. Not a single pedestrian, no taxis, no drunkard stumbling home. Just abandoned cars, some with their doors wide open, others with blood smeared across the windows. When I arrived at the Kremlin, the scene was chaos. Fellow VDV troops were setting up barricades while civilians screamed for refuge. They weren't letting anyone inside. Orders were clear: the Kremlin was to remain impenetrable. It was the last stronghold, the heart of the nation. I took my position atop the Spasskaya Tower, clutching my Alaska 74. The night was freezing, but my hands were slick with sweat. From up there, I had a clear view of the streets leading to Red Square. What I saw still haunts me. They came like a tide, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, people but not really. Their eyes were wild, milky white, and their mouths foamed with black bile. They moved with a twisted, jerking speed, some of them still wearing their torn business suits or pajamas. They were wrong, broken. Shoot only if they breached the outer gates, came the command over my radio. But it didn't matter. The gates didn't last long. As they tore through the first line of defense, I fired. Every shot landed, but they didn't fall like normal people. It took multiple rounds to bring them down. Some kept coming even with half their heads blown off. Around me, my comrades were shouting, cursing, screaming. A group of infected managed to scale the walls. One of them, a young woman, leaped at my friend Misha. He hesitated, maybe recognizing her face, and she tore out his throat before I could shoot her down. "Ivanov, focus," someone yelled, but my ears were ringing. Hours passed like seconds. The streets were painted red, the snow turning to slush under the weight of bodies. The Kremlin's walls, which had stood for centuries, seemed fragile now. We were losing ground fast. By dawn, half of us were dead, either torn apart or turned into one of those things. Those of us who remained were ordered to retreat inside the main fortress. That's when I saw her. Among the infected was a little girl, no older than 7. She stood in the middle of the carnage, clutching a stuffed bear, her face smeared with blood. She wasn't running or attacking, just standing there, staring at me. For a moment I froze. She reminded me of my niece Alina. I used to visit her every Sunday, bringing her candy and telling her stories of my adventures in the military. She thought I was a hero. The girl screamed a sound that wasn't human and sprinted toward me. I didn't have a choice. I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed louder than it should have, and I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. "Ivanov, get inside now." Inside the Kremlin's thick walls, it wasn't any better. The infected had breached the lower levels, and we could hear their guttural howls echoing through the stone corridors. The radios crackled with panicked orders, some conflicting, others outright suicidal. "Fall back to the cathedral," someone shouted. We did. Inside the cathedral of the Archangel, under the cold gaze of saints painted on the walls, we made our last stand. There were only 7 of us left, down from the 50 who had started. We blocked the doors with overturned pews and shattered icons. The infected pounded against the wood, their screams mingling with the sound of our labored breaths. One by one we fell. Dmitri was dragged into the shadows. Sokolov ran out of ammunition and used his bayonet until he disappeared under a wave of clawing hands. It was just me and Captain Petrov by the end. "Ivanov," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We can't let them take this place." He handed me a small object, a detonator. "If they breach the cathedral, you know what to do." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. When the doors finally gave way, I pressed the button. The explosion was deafening, a flash of light and heat that swallowed everything. For a moment I thought I was dead. Maybe I was. I woke up hours later, buried under rubble. My leg was broken, and my rifle was gone. The cathedral was in ruins, the infected nowhere to be seen. I crawled out into the open air, expecting to find survivors. There were none. Moscow was silent again, but it wasn't the same as before. This silence was heavier, oppressive. The Kremlin was a smoldering husk, its walls blackened and broken. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the sky. I should have died with the others, maybe I did in a way. Now as I write this, I can hear them again. Their howls are distant but growing louder. They'll find me soon. This time I won't fight. This time I'll let them take me. The sun was setting now, casting long, blood-red shadows over the ruined city. I could see smoke rising in the distance, fires that would burn until there was nothing left. My body ached with every movement, but I forced myself to crawl a little further, dragging my broken leg behind me. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe I just wanted to see Moscow one last time before the end. I reached Red Square as darkness fell. It was unrecognizable. The cobblestones were cracked and slick with blood. The bodies of the infected and my fallen comrades lay scattered like broken toys, frozen in grotesque poses. The iconic St. Basil's Cathedral stood in the distance, its vibrant domes now blackened with soot. I collapsed in the middle of the square, my strength finally gone. Above me, the stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the frenzied, erratic scuttling of the infected. These were slow, deliberate. Human. A figure emerged from the shadows, a lone soldier in a tattered uniform. He was limping, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. For a moment, hope flickered in my chest. "Comrade," I croaked, my voice barely audible. He turned toward me, and the hope died. His eyes were milky white, his face smeared with black bile. But he didn't attack. He just stood there staring at me, swaying slightly as if caught between two worlds. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. Maybe that was what we all were now, caught in limbo, neither alive nor dead, just ghosts haunting the ruins of a city that had once been unbreakable. The soldier finally moved, staggering past me, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I lay back and closed my eyes, letting the cold seep into my bones. I thought of Alina, of her laughter and the way she used to tug on my sleeve, demanding another story. I thought of Misha Petrov and all the others who had fought and bled for this city. And I thought of Moscow, the city I had sworn to protect. The city I had failed. As the howls of the infected grew louder, closing in from every direction, I felt a strange sense of peace. Let them come. Let them take me. At least I'll be with the others. At least I won't be alone.